Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhardt. Welcome to class today. The class is Ethics and Values, and we're from Utah Valley State. Today I've got Michael Minch with us today. And Michael, we're going to be transitioning from business ethics over to environmental ethics and have a couple of great readings that you've helped us select. So thanks for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. And we've got a couple of students here with us. Over here we've got Rhonda and Luke. Glad you're here. And over here we have Aaron and Lloyd. And so Aaron and Lloyd, appreciate your help too. And Michael, as we move on into religious notions of business, we find that religions do want to make statements about the morality of business. Why is this important?
Well, you know, all religions have ethical teachings, and their moral teachings extend to all realms of human endeavor, all realms of human life. And so obviously human beings give much of their life to exchange, to commerce, to economic relationships. And it's just impossible for any religious tradition to ignore that. And in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament and in so many other texts, there's just a depth and volume of texts that deal directly with our economic relationships that it's just simply unavoidable.
And we need some advice from our spiritual leaders on this, it seems. Maybe Lloyd, Luke, some of you, Aaron, can tell us a little bit about this, but why is it that perhaps we need some advice on greed and avarice and some of these areas? Lloyd, do you want to try it first and then move to anyone else?
For most religions, they're trying to make a social change. They're not just trying to change individual lives, but a lot of them are trying to change, in a lot of sense, change the world. And since business is something that impacts the world, they usually have something to say about business and the environment and all these other aspects that don't just affect us individually, but affect us as communities as well.
Okay, thank you. Aaron?
I would add that it's necessary for a religion to, or a religious tradition to comment on business and economic relationships because they're unavoidably distracting. Our day-to-day lives and the mundane, the profane, are what we spend all of our time dealing with. Food to the mouth and a roof over your head. And for a religious tradition to ignore that would be to ignore its worshipers, its followers, its community. And so it's necessary that they have a comment.
Thank you. Thank you. And Luke or Rhonda?
I don't want to say that people are inherently greedy and selfish, but you might say that they have a propensity towards it. And so many faiths are concerned with that. And when we're talking about economics, business, that's the place where, you know, it's most likely to manifest itself in negative ways.
All right, good comment. And
well, actually, I will say that mankind or womankind are inherently greedy, and I mean, you refer to the natural man. You know, to quote a scripture, the natural man is an enemy to God.
And it's kind of one who is serving maybe two masters,
right?
Or trying to say that they serve two masters, and one is gold and the other is God. And which will you serve? Which will you follow? You
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. You know, Michael, in my textbook I have some readings from religious authors who look at this, and one is from the prophet Muhammad, and he's going to say, he who steals is not one of us. And he's going to say, you don't put the good wheat on the top with bad wheat on the bottom. He says, instead, if we're dealing one with another, then we must be honest in all our business transactions. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of honesty in our business transactions?
Well, like in all areas of life, if honesty is violated, it ruins relationships, it harms community. And if honesty is violated often enough and deeply enough, it makes a social contract impossible. It makes relationships impossible. It makes economic relationships impossible, as well as all others. And, you know, society would unravel.
Okay. And another quote from the prophet Aaron is that he says, I don't want usury. I don't want you charging interest. If someone desperately needs to borrow some money from you, loan it to them and give them terms to pay it back. But if you just add this insult of usury to it, they'll never get it back. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
I think that the idea is that to help one's fellow man is as much an obligation or a duty and a sense of community as it is a privilege that you're affording someone, or it's not as much an optional activity as we sometimes think of it as, and that to charge someone for your opportunity to share or exercise charity is to avoid or ignore this common humanity.
Okay, thank you. But certainly charging interest is very common in humanity, isn't it?
Yeah, this is one of very many instances where there's a profound disconnect between the rhetoric we use to describe ourselves and our practices. Because throughout almost all of Christian history, in addition to Islamic theology, usury is immoral. It's deeply immoral. And usury is charging, interest at even a modest rate, what we would now in our culture think of as a modest rate. And yet our entire economy rests upon what the church, through most of its history, has described as a sin. It's inextricable from our economy as we practice it daily, and yet it's a matter of making money, not by contributing something to society, but by making money off of money, which is the essence of why it was a sin, is that it doesn't actually contribute anything in a direct manner.
Oh, thank you. Very good example on that. Another reading is the Catholic bishop's statement called Economic Justice for All. And in this statement, among other things, they thoroughly quote Jesus Christ and say the most important thing that business can do is to take care of its own community. That they should always see the area in which they're doing business, whether it's locally or globally, as a community, and help out the less fortunate areas and be willing to set up factories in areas that seem less prone to success because of perhaps dilapidation or something. You want to tell us a little bit about the Catholic bishop's letter and why it's so important that community be at the center of economic growth?
Sure. Yeah, the American Catholic bishops occasionally write a pastoral letter to first and foremost Catholics, but by extension to the entire society. And in 1986, they wrote a letter on the U.S. economy. And in the preface to that letter, they give two criteria by which an economic system is to be judged. The first is, does it enhance or detract from human dignity? And the second is, does it enhance or detract from community? And so they were critical of the U.S. economy in '86, as they would always be, probably, unless our economy changes profoundly. And they, in analyzing the economy, and of course, it's not as though, in case people might misunderstand, it's not as though the bishops, who are theologians after all and pastors, do this on their own. They interview and work with countless numbers of economists and technical people and policymakers and so on when they create such a document. But they're critical of the U.S. economy in a number of different ways because it fails to enhance human dignity and enhance community. And so one of the things they do is they give some indications of what a moral economy would look like.
Oh, I appreciate that you brought up the second comment about dignity, because it's absolutely central to that reading, and wouldn't really be explaining it well without saying that. And just one last quick quote comes from a Jewish perspective, and they agree with the Catholic bishop's letter. They have written an article on it, Ronald Green, saying, they start with the 24th Psalm, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Luke, how do you think that might be able to fit in with an overall notion of a business ethic? Does all the wealth belong to us, or has God had a hand in helping us create it?
You might say that God has had a hand in helping us create it.
The Jewish perspective
Yeah,
would.
and I think it's. I think for somebody who is a member of the Jewish faith, that would be a profoundly important statement with regard to how you conduct your practices if you're a business person. Recognizing the fact that the resources that you're making use of are not yours inherently, based on the fact that you purchased rights to it or something. It's something that just like the scripture that you quoted said, it belongs to God.
Okay, and once again, they ask for human dignity and they ask for community participation in the wealth that is created.
Could I add something very briefly to
Sure,
your
please do.
about Psalm 24? Business ethics trades on property. We have property, we own capital, we create products, and we create services. So it's property-based, of course. But theologically, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, this is already morally problematic. And Psalm 24 tells us why, in a nutshell. Because the earth is the Lord's, it's not ours. And so the very notion that we can have property is called into question, because property assumes that we can go grab pieces of the earth and own it. But it's not ours. It belongs to God in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. And so you have, in political philosophy, a lot of work that's been done and a lot more that needs to be done to try to explain how it is we can actually even own property. And that's no small task. And most famously, John Locke tried to pull that off. And, in my view, didn't do such a good job of it. So from a moral perspective, this very idea of property that underlies business ethics is already problematic. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well that's great because we have two very good readings, and I understand you helped select these for our class, and I'm so glad that you did. And the first one is from Vandana Shiva, and can you tell us a little bit about her?
Sure. Well, Vandana Shiva is an extraordinarily prolific author. She's written over 300 articles, many books.
Wow.
Her latest book, just out this year, is on sustainability and democracy. She's the founder of a number of organizations, the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology, and the Living Democracy Movement. She's one of the founders of the International Forum on Globalization. She's a physicist. She has a PhD in physics from Western Ontario University, but she's Indian. She lives in New Delhi. And so she's an intellectual and an activist, and a leading ecofeminist, of course. So she's, one of the important persons in that movement.
Oh, thank you. Well, Aaron, I find this to be a very good transition for us between business ethics and environmental ethics, which we will be dealing with in our next class period. So we have our first reading from Vandana Shiva and our next one from Dr. Hiebert. So would you read the first quote for us, please, from Dr. Shiva?
Number 368.
Yes.
Development was to have created well-being and affluence for all in the third world. For some regions and some people, it has delivered that promise. But for most regions and people, it has instead brought environmental degradation and poverty.
Okay, so we see then that development hasn't done some of the things that it was supposed to do. Can you tell us a little bit about this, Rhonda?
Is development in the third world?
Yes,
Well, it's not really hard to read anything or to see anything having to do with the third world that it's still underdeveloped.
Okay.
It's still lacking in almost any, I'm not talking about luxuries, we're talking about just needs.
All right. You know, I really like the example that she gives of the Titanic and how she pulls Titanic into development. Who'd like to tell me a little bit about the Titanic example? Erin?
I would love to. I thought it was a really great way to open as well. Her example of the Titanic was that, of course, women and children from first class got on the lifeboats first, and then the men in you know, respectful fashion, but that the main numbers of people who passed away due to this tragic accident were women and children. They just happened to be women and children from the third class passengers that were not saved because they were unable to find their way out, unable to have an advocate, and left alone.
They were not only unable, they were locked into those floors and
couldn't escape.
could not.
Okay. And that can still be a transition, can't it?
I think she's looking at that as a definite analogy. I think it works.
That even though you're on the boat, you're locked in perhaps to a system that's not going to work for you. Do you want to tell us about that, Dr. Minch?
Well, Shiva is one of the most insightful theorists of development, and contrary to common assumptions about development, her work and others show that it is not nearly as successful as we would like to think it is. And to put it rather succinctly, rich people on earth think that they transfer a lot of money to poor people in the terms of, in different forms of charity. But actually, the poor people on earth transfer funds to those of us who are rich. And so, for example, when she wrote this particular essay, in that year, there had been $20 billion transferred from the southern hemisphere to where most less developed countries are, to the north, to the most developed countries. Political economists call this dependency theory. That is to say that the vast number of countries in the world are poor and kept poor because they're kept in dependent relationship to the rich. So rich people typically think that the poor are our problem, but more empirically and ethically, the rich are the problem of the poor, not the other way around.
Thank you. And Luke, can you tell us a little bit about that concept? Was it shocking to you as you read this piece?
It's a very interesting argument. I think it's important to understand that a lot of what she's saying is not even that the undeveloped world needs to be developed, but that the process of trying to develop it is what creates true poverty. And she makes what I think is an important distinction that I didn't fully grasp until I first read this article, which is the idea that there's what, me as an American looking at a photo of somebody in a less developed country would perceive as poverty, and what actual poverty is that we'll get into.
Thank you. Good comment there. Well, Lloyd, would you read our next graphic for us and tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Where did the development paradigm go wrong? It focused exclusively on a model of progress derived from Western industrialized economics, on the assumption that Western-style progress was possible for all. Development as the improved well-being of all was thus equated with the westernization of economic categories.
And the next one?
Development thus became a continuation of the colonization process. It became an extension of the project of wealth creation in modern Western patriarchy's economic vision.
Lloyd, can you tell us a little bit about those quotes?
Yeah, she's basically saying that this model of progress and development and our economics today, especially on a global scale, are really outdated and based on an old concept of colonization where, something that was working maybe 300 years ago, but just doesn't work in our globalized society today anymore.
Okay, and some real basic reasons why it's not working. How about it, Erin?
Well, it makes me think of another author named Bell Hooks, who
Yes.
says that our current economic program, paradigm, regular way of going about things, requires that there be an oppressed party, and this is working off of other thinkers. But Hooks adds to that oppressed party, that group on the bottom rung of the economic scale, is typically women and children, and typically women and children of color, women and children in these countries that we're speaking of.
How dire is this, Michael?
Well, you know, women are half the people on earth, but they do 2/3 of the work.
Mm-hmm.
They have 1/10 of the income, and they own 1/100th of the property. And, you know, that's problematic. And, you know, it's not only people like Bell Hooks or Marx or others who recognize that for some people to thrive economically, other people can't.
Mm-hmm.
But even built into, you know, economics 101 or, you know, in any business school is the well-known fact that one way to keep your business costs down is to pay the least amount of labor possible.
Sure.
And, you know, labor paid cheaply enough keeps people poor. Indeed, it drives towards slavery, and that's why we have 27 million slaves on earth at this moment.
And that's another amazing statistic as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and read the next graphic. And would you read this for us, Rhonda?
Development focused exclusively on such financial indicators as the gross domestic product. What these indicators could not demonstrate was the environmental destruction and the creation of poverty associated with the development process.
Okay, thanks. And so in this, and Michael, this quote that Rhonda just read for us, we changed it to gross domestic product. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, you know, the gross domestic product is exactly the same thing as gross national product. It's just that economists have switched to different language. But that
Okay.
is really the way that economists and politicians and others measure the wealth of a society, the wealth of a state. And it takes into account a lot of different factors, which we don't need to mention here. But it's just the bank account of any particular society.
And sometimes we just don't even look at those because we say, oh, well, is this all that important? But Shiva is definitely saying it's important. She's saying what you have here are people who are truly being harmed by development that was supposed to help them.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And you know, Luke began to say a few words about this moments ago, but it's not accidental. I mean, sometimes it is, of course, but it's not fundamentally accidental that efforts in development harm people. Efforts in development are to the greatest interest of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, and those who have money and who lend money and who finance projects do so because they think they're going to benefit from it. And they do benefit from it, and they often benefit from it at the expense of those who are poor and remain poor. And so there's a kind of insidious dynamic that she's done a lot of work, you know, to explicate. But the idea that development is something rich people do on behalf of the poor people is too simple a notion. It's naive and not altogether accurate.
And she makes that argument throughout. Yes,
yeah.
thank you. Well, let's have Luke read the next graphic for us and explain it to us. So, Luke.
Okay. Such indicators as GDP can measure only those activities that take place through the market mechanism, regardless of whether or not such activities are productive, unproductive, or destructive. In the market economy, the organizing principle for natural resource use is maximization of profits and capital accumulation.
Okay, tell us about this.
Along the lines of what Michael was just saying, you know, it's as if we've gone and said, this is how we measure progress, whether or not you're doing well as a country. And we've defined it in a way that measures things incorrectly and doesn't measure certain things. And as a result, we have all of these nations competing to maximize their gross domestic product. But to compete in that way, in order to get loans from the IMF or the World Bank, and to develop prestige and so forth, that's what leads them to, promote sweatshop labor in their countries, to promote essentially human slavery, human trafficking, and environmental destruction on a scale that is just incredible in countries like China.
Oh, outstanding observation. Any other students want to add to this? Okay, well, we'll go ahead with the next graphic. And Erin, would you read this for us, please?
The conventional paradigm of development perceives poverty only in terms of an absence of Western consumption patterns or in terms of cash incomes, and therefore is unable to grapple with the self-provisioning economies or to include the poverty created by their destruction through development.
Okay, Erin, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think Luke alluded to it earlier in the sense that what we often see as poverty is an absence of things, is an absence of what we see here in the West or in quote-unquote developed countries as an absence of those goods which define for us success or material possessions, and that this way of measurement with the GDP and these market mechanisms and these things, it's completely incapable of measuring a different kind of survival, a different kind of subsistence.
And it's almost one we don't want to know about, isn't it, Michael?
Well, it is. I think there are a lot of ways that we organize data to make ourselves feel better.
Feel better, sure.
And this is an example, as both Luke and Erin have indicated. We tend to measure economic health, what we call economic health, by indicators such as consumption of certain kinds of consumer goods that are almost always tied to environmental degradation, size of gross domestic product, and so on. But from a moral standpoint, we shouldn't be so much interested in, for example, how much money there is, but rather how it's distributed. And so I'm not concerned in the United States or in Canada or in India or in Rwanda so much in the gross domestic product. I'm interested in who's starving, and who has health care, and who has access to food, and who has work. And so we use the wrong kind of indicators when measuring economic health tied back to moral health. And this is the kind of thing that the Catholic bishops were trying to get us to recognize, that the proper indicators are those we can use to measure whether human dignity and human community are being enhanced or being harmed.
Thank you. And there are things that just don't perhaps chart or haven't been put on a chart before, but definitely could be charted.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Okay. Well, Lloyd, would you read our next graphic for us and tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. The cultural perception of prudent subsistence living as poverty has provided legitimization for the development process as poverty removal project. Development as a culturally biased process destroys wholesome and sustainable lifestyles and instead creates a real material poverty and misery by denying the means of survival through the diversion of resources to resource-intensive commodity production.
Okay, tell us how this equates.
I think a great example of this was what we saw here in the Americas as the Americans are moving west and started removing Native Americans and whatnot from their homes and from their lands, is because they came in with an attitude of, well, this is what it means to have a good lifestyle. This is what it means to be wealthy and to do all this stuff. Well, they already had their own lifestyles where they were completely happy and fine. But it's when others came in, the white man came in and told them this is how you're supposed to live, that all of a sudden they became poor. They weren't poor, they were doing fine until other people told them they were poor and told them how to live this way and kept them from living their lifestyle that was doing perfectly fine for them.
Wonderful example. Very well done. Anyone want to add anything else to it? Rhonda?
Yeah, I think in today, just look at the United States, for instance. When we think of cultural, I'm going to put women, single mothers, single women, with children, in a cultural name, if you will. And I see them as the least of, They're the ones that sink to the bottom, with a divorce, or with the women who have children. The children are deprived of so many material things, including food.
And it's something that is so important for us to study as we're looking at ethics. Instead of turning our head away from it, it's something that we really must focus on, whether it's in this country or a third world country. Would you read our next couple of graphics for us, Rhonda?
Sure. A creation of inequality through ecologically disruptive economic activity. Number one, inequalities in the distribution of privileges and power make for unequal access to natural resources. These include privileges of both the political and economic nature. And the second, government policy enables resource-intensive production processes to gain access to the raw material that many people, especially from the less privileged economic groups, depend upon for their survival.
So, Michael, these should be things we should just see, but actually we don't want to see them, do we? Can you tell us a little bit about these concepts we've just been reading about?
Well, the United States is the most affluent country that's existed in human history, the United States in which we presently live. And we've lost touch, as the typical American has lost touch with how the food she eats gets to her table, and the products we buy get to our home, and so on. And Shiva is touching on this, that there are raw materials in the world used to manufacture goods and grow crops and so on. And the poorer people of the world are closer to those raw materials. And in many cases, as a rather constant pattern, richer countries, through their economic power, take those raw materials and leapfrog several sorts of steps to create high-end consumer goods that only the wealthy can afford. For example, this is very simple, but it takes 13 pounds of grain to make 1 pound of beef. Americans prefer to eat beef rather than grain, but in doing, we've sacrificed, in a sense, 12 pounds of grain, many gallons of water, all kinds of land that could have been used more productively. And, we get beef shipped to us from Argentina and Brazil and other places. And this is very inefficient, it's not productive, it's something only the affluent can afford, and it has sort of violated a particular natural process from raw goods to, what would normally be the first order use of that good. And, the examples are limitless, but that's one that comes to my mind.
Okay, thanks. Aaron?
Actually, I think Luke had a comment first, so I'll
okay,
let him
go ahead, Luke.
Thanks. I was just going to add to that, if you think about it, probably every one of us here, and probably the people watching at home, has at least one article of clothing on that was produced in a sweatshop. And additionally, between the materials and the clothing, the things we're wearing, they're coming from all over the globe so that I can sit here and wear them. It's amazing the amount to think about the energy put into shipping, producing, all of that, just so that, I can sit here and wear my cranberry-colored shirt or whatever this thing is.
Sure,
So-
and the right brand too. And she
Yeah.
says, really, there's nothing wrong with this wheat, with eating this wheat, and there's nothing wrong with the raw materials that can be easily produced by folks and not have a fancy brand or a fancy color associated with it.
And one of the ironies, if I might break in,
Sure.
of contemporary capitalist thought is that, we're supposed to be so efficient and so productive, but it's radically inefficient to ship things from all over everywhere to make some of us very marginally more happy because we have that shirt rather than another one. And so local economies where people grow and produce and make and consume things locally make the most efficient sense. And only when that's not possible does it make sense to extend markets beyond local economies. But of course we live in global capitalism, a in globalization. And markets extend everywhere from everywhere, and the vast network of markets, however inefficient it is, serves the desires, if not the needs, of the most affluent. But the needs of the poor are often sacrificed in globalization.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to move through the rest of this reading a little more quickly so that we get on to the second one. We've had so much fun talking about this reading that it's too bad it's not the only one for this class period. But let's go on and look at the next two graphics. And would you read these for us, Aaron?
Development and dispossession augmented the colonial processes of ecological degradation and the loss of political control over nature's sustenance base. Economic growth was a new colonialism, draining resources away from those who most needed them.
Okay, so here we're talking about colonialism again. Lloyd, tell us a little bit about colonialism.
Well, colonialism is kind of like the forefront of globalization, where instead of countries just staying where they're put, they're starting to spread out into what they consider underdeveloped places, and so they're going into new lands and whatnot, and pushing their new Western ideals and economics and everything onto those people. In a lot of ways, stripping and causing what we were talking about before, taking away the resources and whatnot from others.
Okay, thanks. And so then, Michael, we move up with this UN declaration where they want to have a UN decade for the woman, where they really focus on saying, look at the poverty that capitalism is creating in third world countries and even first and second world countries for women and children. Mm-hmm. So let's go ahead and pull this up and have Rhonda read it for us, and then maybe you could tell us a little bit about it, Michael.
Okay.
The almost uniform conclusion of the decade's research is that, with a few exceptions, women's relative access to economic resources, incomes, and employment has worsened. Their burden of work has increased, and their relative and even absolute health, nutritional, and educational status has declined.
Okay, so we have a decade focusing on many of these concepts and more. Can you tell us, has it worked? Did it work?
Well, I agree with Shiva. It, for the most part, it didn't work. You know, the UN does a lot of good things, and they try to focus the world's attention, particularly the affluent and powerful in the world, their attention on a number of things, a decade for children, mm-hmm. a decade for mm-hmm. women, and so on. And, you know, they seek to help address problems by publishing literature and redirecting some of the UN funding in certain directions. But fundamentally, the problem here that Shiva is pointing to is that even when there was a decade given over to trying to redress the problem of poverty mm-hmm. among women and children globally, you know, if the paradigm mechanism for alleviating that poverty is development, mm-hmm. it's not going to work. And it didn't work, because we have particular kinds of understandings of development that have all these problems built into it, which we've been discussing these last, few moments.
All right, thank you. And in fact, we've just found that there's even a bigger poverty trap. Luke, would you read these next two graphics for us on this poverty trap?
Mm-hmm. I would. The poverty trap created through the vicious cycle of development, debt, environmental destruction, and structural adjustment is most significantly experienced by women and children. In 1988, 500,000 children died as a direct result of debt-related adjustment policies that sustained the North's economic growth.
Okay, so Luke, maybe this isn't something that you saw on a pie chart or an economic graph or some GDP indicator, but tell us a little bit about this ethical statement.
It's clear that sort of the problems of debt and the need of countries, as we spoke about earlier, feeling that they need to compete and they need to, build up their infrastructure and so forth, that requires them to seek loans more and more from these international finance institutes. And that debt, the destruction, all these things that she talks about here, lead to people dying and being impoverished. And in many ways, some would argue that even the more beneficial things that institutions like the World Bank do, where they're trying to help impoverished people create a financial plan and so forth, it also contributes to destruction.
Okay, thank you very much. A concluding comment for us on this reading then by Vandana Shiva.
Okay. Well, I might, in a way, this symbolizes a concluding comment, and it's also specific to what Luke just said, and that is, the millennium turned to 6 years ago, and there were millennial goals set by many countries to increase the percentage of their gross domestic product they would give to international aid, and the Pope worked hard. Bono worked hard. A lot of people worked hard. It was the year of Jubilee, which is a Hebrew concept from Leviticus. And poverty has continued to grow, and the wealthy nations of the world have not increased their international aid, and the gap, which is growing, is so as wide as it gets. 4% of the wealth of the 224 richest people on earth could eliminate poverty. The 41 poorest countries on earth, in respect to the debt that they owe the United States, could be forgiven and wiped out in a second. And all it would cost is $2.42 out of each one of our pockets. And so this is the kind of moral obligation we have. And if we had the moral will to address it, we could address it. And yet when we create development schemes and we transfer money around the globe and do that kind of thing, it almost always is to the benefit of the affluent rather than the poor.
All right. And I think that this article is truly a wake-up call, and one that's very good for our students to have in discussions as we look at business ethics. And now we're going to turn just a little bit more into environmental ethics and how religion plays a role in environmental ethics. Can you tell us a little bit about Dr. Hiebert and his works?
Sure. Theodore Hiebert teaches at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, and he's a professor of Hebrew Bible and in Hebrew, and he has his training in Hebrew and in the Hebrew Scriptures from Harvard. And he's written a lot about the ancient Hebrew theologies as they relate to the earth, to the land, and to our responsibility, and so on. And the assignment the students have today came out of a book entitled Christianity and Ecology, which was a compilation of essays put together from a conference co-sponsored by Harvard University and Harvard Divinity School. And
And such an interesting article that was selected for this class. Lloyd, tell us just a little bit about the privileging of the human being when it comes to the earth and the human being having stewardship and dominion over the rest of the earth.
Well, I actually have this discussion every now and then with some friends, and it's the idea that, and for the most part, as people, we feel like we're the privileged ones. The earth was, from a religious perspective, earth was created for man, and so it's for our use to do with however we will. It's under our control, and if animals die, so be it. As long as we're there, as fields are gone, it's fine. They're given for us, and so they're for us to use.
Okay, but Hiebert's not going to go along with this, is he, Aaron?
Actually, I think it's interesting how Hiebert will address not only Lloyd's point, but this other perspective of the idea that Genesis 1, where I think a lot of this thought process comes from, a lot of the reference to dominion and stewardship comes from, that it also kind of states that we are not in necessarily a pinnacle creation, but one of many, and that we participate in almost an earthly community of creations.
Okay, thank you. And so, Luke, perhaps we've been misreading Genesis according to Hiebert. And how does he think that maybe through different translations we should be looking more closely at Genesis?
Well, in Genesis, he talks about kind of the difference between the first chapter of Genesis and the second and third chapters, and how we have basically two different voices there. As a Hebrew scholar, it becomes very apparent to Hiebert. And I actually had a question on this. To me, it almost seems as if he's arguing, or that you could argue, that it's, sort of the same way the Gospels and the New Testament are telling the same story, but they tell it from different perspectives and to different audiences. We kind of had the same thing with the creation story. Would you say that?
That's exactly right. The first creation narrative is the first chapter of Genesis, and the second creation narrative is the second chapter, and they have important differences and important similarities. But for purposes of this reading, the idea of dominion that we encounter in the first creation narrative is a call by God to humankind to have the kind of responsibility, and the Hebrew word means to be responsible for. To have the kind of responsibility for creation that God has over humanity and creation. That is, to image God, we're made in God's image, to image God's love, to image God's care, to image God's compassion, and so on. The second creation narrative, of course, finds humankind in the garden. And what are they told to do? They're told to tend the garden, to take care of the garden. And as soon as they sin, what do? They start tearing leaves off trees. So the anthropomorphism, or anthropocentrism, which is the essence of the sin, immediately not only fractures human relationships with God and human relationships with one another, but human relationships with nature.
All right, very good. And that really pulls us up to the point in the reading where we're talking about the humanist farmer. It's number 361, and we see then that there are special privileges that are given to the human. And in fact, perhaps I'll have Rhonda go ahead and read that quote for us about the humanist farmer. So, Rhonda.
The understanding of the human vocation as farming is underscored by the task God assigns the first human to till or cultivate the garden soil. It is the archetypal activity by which human life is defined at the very beginning of the Eden narrative.
Go ahead.
There was no man, Adam, to cultivate the arable soil.
Okay, thank you. Michael, do you want to tell us a little bit about the humanist farmer?
Yeah, the Adam is the Hebrew for man,
Adam.
as we see. Hadamah is Hebrew for earth. So in Hebrew, the name of the first human creature is earthling. And we know that human comes from humus and so on. And so what Hiebert is drawing our attention to here is the intrinsic and important relationship between humankind and the earth and all of the rest of creation. And so our vocation as farmers is a reminder of and an extension of this intimate relationship we have with the very stuff out of which we were made in the second narrative, creation narrative.
Okay, thank you. And so, Lloyd, Hiebert then absolutely says, we don't have dominion. What does he say?
Well, he says rather than dominion, we're actually slaves or servants of the land. You know, where we've come out of the land and we're there to serve the land and to take care of it. Okay,
thank you. And Michael, what else would he like us to take away from this notion about it doesn't? We're not to have dominion over animals. We're not to have dominion over every living thing.
Well. He wants us to know that the biblical accounts, and he's focusing, of course, on the first two creation narratives and primarily on the second narrative. He wants us to know that we have this essential, intrinsic, paradigmatic relationship to all of creation which is a reflection of God's relationship with us. And so we are caretakers, we are servants, we are we're all created. And all by we I mean not only humankind but other kind. And so dominion is badly understood when it's understood to mean to exercise power over. And that's precisely not the kind of responsibility or power or license that we're given.
Okay, great. And that ties right in with our next two quotes. Luke, could you read these for us and tell us a little bit about them?
The verb employed by the Yahwist for cultivation is not kabas, subdue, used by the priestly writer in Genesis 1, but abad, serve. In the Hebrew scriptures, abad is the customary term to express servitude of slave to master, of one people to another, and of Israel's service to God in its life and worship. This way of speaking of agriculture views the human as the servant, not the master of the land. It emphasizes human dependence on rather than dominion over the earth.
Okay, thanks. You want to tell us about that, Luke, and then we'll have Rhonda make a comment.
Yeah, it's interesting, when God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden, he tells them that they're going to have to work the land for the rest of their lives, and that's kind of their lot in life. And I think that's kind of interesting in light of sort of some of the things that Shiva talks about, and the idea that so much of what we're trying to do in modern economics is make ourselves independent of the land, not need to rely on it anymore. I think it's also interesting here to think about in terms of dominion, and Michael can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Adam is also supposed to name all the animals, and in Hebrew tradition that means he's supposed to take care of them. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, in the Hebrew tradition, to name is to have responsibility for and to care for.
Yeah,
exactly.
I was just thinking of the word or the words authority and dominion and those power words that I had always, I don't remember where I had read this, but if we were to insert the word preside and stewardship, that it gave an entirely different meaning, to authority. I mean, most of us think of authority as, strong and unbending, but if we preside over something, then we have responsibility too.
All right, good comment. Other additions to this then? All right, so having a better understanding then of the equal system that we have between nature and humans is a major point then for Shiva. I'm sorry, not Shiva, Hiebert.
Yep.
And I think he makes some very good build-up arguments for this.
Yeah, I might mention just very briefly that it would be wrong for our viewers to think of Hiebert's interpretation, his exegesis of these texts, as unique to him. There's absolute consensus among biblical scholars that this is the only way to understand these texts. There's no dissent, among theologians.
All right, I'm glad you added that too. Well, let's pull up the next graphic, and Lloyd, would you read this for us, please?
Sure. Stewardship. Most recent church statements and constructive theologies take as their starting point the theology of dominion in Genesis 1. To be sure, they invest heavily in an interpretation of dominion that denies any self-serving, exploitive connotations to it, and emphasize instead responsible, benevolent dimensions of biblical dominion.
And continued?
As a description of such responsible dominion, the term stewardship has been coined, a term that has come to be regarded more than any other as a summation of the Christian view of human vocation.
Thank you, and I'm so glad, Michael, that you had added that concept for us, that basically all of theologists, most theologies agree with this. Okay, Aaron?
Well, not to anthropomorphize even more relationships with God, but I as a parent, I think of my child, and to have dominion, to say that I have dominion over my child certainly does not characterize appropriately my relationship with my child. To say I have a stewardship, on the other hand, does say that it involve more of a caretaking, a benevolence, like they refer to here, a tenderness that I think dominion doesn't often carry those connotations. Does that mean that sometimes I have to drive the oxen to get them out? Yes, unfortunately. But for the most part, it involves these more tender connotations.
Oh, I think that's a lovely analogy. Any thoughts or comments on that, Michael?
Well, you know, Aaron, you're absolutely right. And I think we only have this misshapen understanding of dominion because we've allowed that to happen in English. Even the English roots of the word don't mean what we often now take it to mean. But to import that misunderstanding into the Hebrew is to do much justice to the Hebrew. So, you know, I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're coming to the end of this reading. Would anyone like to add some concluding comments? How about you, Luke?
I think this is really an interesting reading in the sense that Hiebert, for us, he takes, even if you just want to take the first Genesis account, then you still, and really understand what the Hebrew in it means, you come up with a very different interpretation of what the biblical commandments are in reference to the earth and so forth than most people think. But then if you take the second chapter of Genesis as well, then you really get a different account. And if you combine them and so forth, then you get a different understanding of the relationship between man and the earth.
Okay, thanks. Michael, about 30 seconds. How would you close it up?
Well, I might just briefly mention that, you know, one can look in the Hebrew texts and in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament in many other respects to find the same kind of theology of care of nature underlined. It's not only in the first two chapters of Genesis, but, you know, we're told to care for nature in a number of ways. And in fact, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he writes that creation itself suffers because of our negligence, because of our anthropocentric ways, and that the day will come when it too will be redeemed, and it'll be redeemed in part from the harm we do to it.
Ah, nice conclusion. Thanks so much, Michael and students.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.